Dust rose from the plains of Syria as two great armies moved toward each other, both convinced that destiny was on their side. One was led by a young pharaoh who believed the gods had chosen him for eternal glory. The other was commanded by a cautious empire determined not to lose its grip on the ancient world's most valuable crossroads. Each side thought the other was weaker, slower, unprepared. Each side was wrong. How did a single battle nearly destroy Egypt's most powerful ruler? Why did the clash between these two empires end not with conquest, but with the world's first known peace treaty? And what really happened at Kadesh, beyond the propaganda carved into stone? In this video, I'm going to discuss all of this, how it began, what happened, and how it changed the world. So without any delay, let's start. Long before swords clashed at Kadesh, the stage for this conflict had been quietly set by geography and ambition. The ancient Near East was a mosaic of trade routes, fertile river valleys, and contested borderlands, and at its center lay Syria, a region that connected Egypt to Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. Control of Syria meant control of commerce, influence, and security. For centuries, Egypt had projected its power northward, especially during the height of the New Kingdom, when pharaohs saw themselves not just as kings of the Nile, but as rulers of an international empire. Fortresses, garrisons, and loyal vassal cities stretched from Canaan into southern Syria, creating a buffer zone between Egypt and rival powers. But Egypt was no longer alone in seeking dominance. To the north, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, the Hittite Empire had risen with remarkable speed. Once a collection of competing city-states, the Hittites unified under powerful kings who mastered diplomacy as well as warfare. They absorbed neighboring territories, defeated rivals like Mitanni, and pushed steadily southward. As Hittite influence expanded, the fragile balance of power in Syria began to tilt. Cities that had once sworn loyalty to Egypt now found themselves courted, threatened, or conquered by the Hittites. Allegiances shifted, sometimes overnight, depending on which empire appeared stronger at the moment. This was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of world views. Egypt saw foreign lands as extensions of divine order, places where the pharaoh's authority brought harmony and stability. The Hittites, on the other hand, approached empire as a network of treaties, obligations, and calculated force. Where Egypt relied on tradition and prestige, the Hittites relied on adaptability and political realism. These differences shaped how each side prepared for war and how disastrously they misjudged each other. The city of Kadesh became the focal point of this growing tension. Situated near the Orontes River, Kadesh controlled a strategic crossing and served as a gateway between northern and southern Syria. It was heavily fortified, economically valuable, and symbolically important. Whoever held Kadesh could influence trade routes and military movements across the region. At various points, it had shifted hands between local rulers, Egyptian allies, and Hittite control. Each transfer deepened resentment and suspicion. By the time a new pharaoh named Ramesses II ascended the Egyptian throne, Kadesh stood as a personal challenge to his authority. Ramesses II was young, ambitious, and determined to prove himself worthy of his lineage. He inherited an empire that was still powerful, but no longer unquestioned. His father, Seti I, had campaigned in Syria and even briefly reclaimed Kadesh, but failed to hold it permanently. To Ramesses, this unfinished business was more than a strategic concern. It was a test of legitimacy. Victory at Kadesh would silence rivals at home, intimidate enemies abroad, and secure his legacy as a warrior king chosen by the gods. On the Hittite side, King Muwatalli II viewed the situation very differently. He had moved the Hittite capital southward, closer to the Syrian frontier, signaling how vital the region had become. He understood that Egypt's strength lay in its confidence and reputation, but he also recognized its vulnerabilities. Egyptian armies were formidable, yet heavily dependent on supply lines stretching across deserts and hostile territory. Muwatalli's strategy was not to confront Egypt head-on in a conventional display of force, but to exploit Egyptian assumptions, patience, and overconfidence. As Ramesses prepared for his campaign, the machinery of war rolled into motion. Egypt's army was organized into divisions named after gods, each with infantry, chariots, and support units. Chariots were the pride of Egyptian warfare, fast, maneuverable, and deadly when used correctly. Ramesses led his troops northward from the Nile Delta, crossing Sinai and Canaan in a show of power meant to intimidate local rulers into submission. Along the way, cities offered tribute, reaffirmed loyalty, and opened their gates, reinforcing Ramesses' belief that the campaign would unfold smoothly. But beneath the surface, the situation was far more dangerous than Ramesses realized. The Hittites had not been idle. Muwatalli II assembled a vast coalition of allies and vassals from across Anatolia and northern Syria. His army included thousands of chariots, many heavier and more robust than their Egyptian counterparts. Unlike Egypt's relatively uniform force, the Hittite army was a diverse collection of contingents, united by shared interest rather than shared identity. This diversity made coordination difficult, but it also gave the Hittites numerical depth and tactical flexibility. Information, or the lack thereof, would prove decisive. As Ramesses advanced toward Kadesh, he relied on scouts and intelligence reports to assess enemy movements. Somewhere along the road, he encountered two men who claimed to be deserters from the Hittite army. They told him what he wanted to hear, that Muwatalli and his forces were far to the north, fearful of engaging the mighty Egyptians. This confirmed Ramesses' expectations and encouraged him to press forward aggressively without waiting for all his divisions to fully regroup. In reality, the Hittite army was much closer than Ramesses believed, concealed behind the city of Kadesh and the surrounding terrain. Muwatalli had anticipated Egyptian confidence and used deception to draw the pharaoh into a vulnerable position. As Ramesses set up camp near the Orontes River, separated from parts of his own army, he unknowingly walked into one of the most carefully prepared ambushes of the ancient world. What followed was not the glorious one-sided victory Ramesses had imagined, but a chaotic struggle that would push both empires to their limits and force them to reconsider what victory truly meant. As the Egyptian camp took shape near the banks of the Orontes, the illusion of control still surrounded Ramesses. His personal division, the division of Amun, had arrived first and began establishing defenses, confident that the remaining divisions were close behind. To Ramesses, this pause felt like the calm before a triumphant advance. But beneath the dust and noise of preparation, the battlefield was already tilting against him. The Hittite king had chosen this moment with precision. Muwatalli watched from a distance, his army hidden and silent, waiting for the exact instant when Egyptian confidence would become vulnerability. The truth about the Hittite position emerged suddenly and violently. Egyptian scouts captured two Hittite spies who, under interrogation, revealed the deception. The enemy was not far away. They were already there, concealed behind Kadesh, their chariots massed and ready. The revelation struck like a blow, but before Ramesses could fully react, the Hittite attack began. Thousands of chariots surged forward, not in a cautious formation, but in a sweeping charge designed to overwhelm through shock and speed. Dust clouds rose so thick that visibility collapsed, and the sound of wheels, hooves, and shouting men drowned out all order. The first Egyptian unit to encounter this assault was the division of Ra, marching toward the camp and completely unprepared for such an ambush. The Hittite chariots tore into them with devastating force. Egyptian ranks collapsed almost instantly as soldiers scattered in confusion, trampled or cut down before they could form a defensive line. This was not a controlled engagement, but a rout, and the survivors fled directly toward Ramesses' camp, carrying panic with them. What was meant to be a secure base instantly became a place of chaos as fleeing troops smashed through tents, supply wagons overturned, and command structures dissolved. Ramesses found himself at the center of a disaster unfolding faster than any plan could contain. His army was divided, his intelligence had failed, and the enemy was now inside his camp. In Egyptian accounts, this is the moment where the narrative transforms from military history into legend. Ramesses later claimed that he stood alone, abandoned by his officers and men, calling out to the god Amun for strength. According to these inscriptions, divine favor filled him with courage, and he charged into the enemy ranks, scattering them like chaff before the wind. Reality, however, was more complex and far less heroic. Ramesses was not truly alone, but his situation was undeniably desperate. His personal guard and remaining chariot units rallied around him, forming a defensive core amid the chaos. Egyptian chariots, lighter and more maneuverable than their Hittite counterparts, began to exploit openings created by the enemy's overextension. The Hittite charioteers, intoxicated by early success, had broken formation to loot the camp, abandoning the discipline that had made their ambush so effective. This moment of disorder proved critical. Egyptian reinforcements, particularly the arrival of the Naran troops, possibly allied or mercenary forces stationed nearby, shifted the balance just enough to prevent total collapse. These fresh soldiers attacked the exposed Hittite chariots from the flank, forcing them to retreat toward the river. What had begun as a near annihilation of the Egyptian army transformed into a brutal, grinding struggle for survival. Meanwhile, Muwatalli made a decision that historians still debate. Despite having additional reserves available, he chose not to commit his full force to finish off Ramesses. From his vantage point near Kadesh, he may have believed victory was already secured, or he may have feared exposing his own position to a counterattack. The Hittite strategy had succeeded beyond expectation, but its very success created uncertainty. In ancient warfare, information traveled slowly, and battlefield chaos often obscured reality. Muwatalli could not see the full extent of Egyptian resistance forming within the camp. As the fighting continued, exhaustion set in on both sides. The Orontes River became a barrier as much as a refuge, with chariots struggling in marshy terrain and infantry bogged down by uneven ground. Neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with wrecked chariots, fallen horses, and the bodies of men who had been swept into a conflict shaped as much by deception and chance as by strategy. In the immediate aftermath, both sides claimed victory. Ramesses returned to Egypt proclaiming divine triumph, commissioning monumental reliefs that depicted him single-handedly defeating countless enemies. These images were carved into temple walls across the empire, transforming a narrowly avoided catastrophe into a story of heroic dominance. For generations, this version of events shaped how the Battle of Kadesh was remembered, reinforcing the idea that the pharaoh was invincible when supported by the gods. The Hittites, however, told a different story. From their perspective, Egypt had failed to reclaim Kadesh. The city remained under Hittite control, and the strategic balance in Syria was preserved. Muwatalli had successfully checked Egyptian expansion without risking the annihilation of his own army. In practical terms, the Hittites achieved their objective. The Egyptian advance was halted, and the illusion of uncontested Egyptian supremacy was broken. This contradiction between perception and reality is what makes Kadesh so significant. It was not a decisive military victory for either side, but it exposed the limits of imperial power in a world where logistics, intelligence, and alliances mattered as much as raw strength. Ramesses expected a straightforward campaign that would cement his authority. Instead, he encountered a sophisticated enemy capable of exploiting his assumptions. The Hittites, for their part, learned that even a well-executed ambush could spiral into uncertainty if not followed through decisively. In the years that followed, neither empire could afford a prolonged war of attrition in Syria. Egypt faced internal pressures, monumental building projects, and the need to maintain stability along its vast borders. The Hittites confronted threats from other rivals and unrest within their sphere of influence. Kadesh had demonstrated that endless warfare would drain resources without guaranteeing dominance. Gradually, diplomacy replaced confrontation. What emerged from this uneasy stalemate was something unprecedented in recorded history, a formal peace treaty between two great powers negotiated not out of goodwill but mutual exhaustion and strategic calculation. This agreement would redefine how empires interacted, marking a shift from conquest to coexistence and laying the groundwork for international relations as we understand them today. But the treaty itself, its language, and its implications would reveal even deeper truths about power, fear, and the fragile balance that held the ancient world together. The decision to move from war to diplomacy did not happen overnight, and it did not come from a sudden realization that peace was noble or morally superior. It came from pressure, uncertainty, and the recognition that continued conflict could unravel both empires from within. In the years after Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittite Empire continued to maneuver, testing each other's resolve through smaller campaigns, shifting alliances, and political signals, rather than open confrontation. Syria remained tense, a land filled with watchful garrisons and cities that had learned to survive by carefully balancing loyalty and defiance. For Ramesses II, the battle left a complicated legacy. Publicly, he projected absolute confidence. His monuments told a story of divine favor and overwhelming strength, and this narrative served a clear political purpose. Egypt was a society where the pharaoh's authority was inseparable from the idea of cosmic order. Admitting vulnerability was not an option. Yet behind the carved stone and ritual proclamations, Egyptian policy grew more cautious. The northern frontier was reinforced, not expanded. Resources were redirected toward internal consolidation rather than further large-scale invasions into Hittite territory. The Hittites, too, were navigating dangerous terrain. Muwatalli II did not live long after the battle, and his death introduced instability into the empire's leadership. His successor inherited a realm that was powerful but stretched thin. Maintaining control over distant vassals required constant attention, and rebellion was always a threat. The Hittite system depended on loyalty enforced through treaties, hostages, and the implicit threat of force. A prolonged war with Egypt risked weakening that system, encouraging subject states to test the empire's limits. At the same time, new dangers were emerging beyond the horizon. In Anatolia and the Aegean world, populations were shifting. Trade networks showed signs of strain. While the full scale of the late Bronze Age collapse was still generations away, the early warning signs were already present. In this environment, stability mattered more than spectacle. Both Egypt and the Hittites began to see value in a different kind of power, one that relied less on constant warfare and more on predictable relationships. The peace treaty that eventually emerged was revolutionary not because it ended all conflict, but because it formalized restraint. The agreement, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, laid out terms that went beyond a simple cessation of hostilities. It recognized mutual sovereignty, pledged non-aggression, and included provisions for extradition and military assistance. In essence, it acknowledged that neither empire could dominate the other without unacceptable cost. What is striking about the treaty is its language. It does not frame peace as submission or defeat. Instead, it presents the agreement as a mutual decision sanctioned by the gods of both cultures. This was diplomacy shaped by religious legitimacy, designed to make compromise acceptable in societies that valued honor and divine approval above all else. By invoking their gods as witnesses, both sides bound themselves not just politically but spiritually to the terms of peace. For Ramesses, the treaty allowed him to secure his legacy without risking another Kadesh. He could claim victory through stability, portraying peace as evidence of Egypt's enduring strength rather than its limitations. For the Hittites, the agreement ensured recognition as an equal power, something no amount of battlefield success alone could guarantee. In a world where reputation could deter war as effectively as armies, this recognition mattered deeply. The aftermath of the treaty reshaped daily life in Syria. Trade routes reopened, diplomatic marriages reinforced alliances, and cities previously caught between empires found a degree of breathing room. The region did not become peaceful in any modern sense, but it became predictable, and in the ancient world, predictability was a form of security. Merchants could travel with greater confidence, local rulers could plan beyond immediate survival, and imperial administrators could focus on governance rather than constant mobilization. Yet the Battle of Kadesh remained a cautionary tale beneath this surface calm. For Egypt, it exposed the dangers of overconfidence and flawed intelligence. Ramesses had marched north believing his reputation alone would ensure success, only to discover that information could be manipulated and assumptions exploited. For the Hittites, Kadesh revealed both the power and the risk of deception. Their ambush nearly destroyed the Egyptian army, but their failure to fully commit left the outcome unresolved, demonstrating how hesitation at the wrong moment could erase a decisive advantage. In military terms, Kadesh also marked a turning point in how chariot warfare was understood. Both sides fielded massive chariot forces, yet the battle showed that numbers alone were not decisive. Terrain, coordination, and discipline mattered more than sheer quantity. The chaos that engulfed the battlefield underscored the limits of centralized command in ancient warfare. Once formations broke down, individual initiative and local leadership determined survival. The battle's memory, preserved through inscriptions, reliefs, and later historical analysis, offers rare insight into how ancient states shaped truth to serve power. Ramesses' version of events dominated Egyptian history for centuries, not because it was entirely accurate, but because it was useful. It reinforced the idea of the pharaoh as a divinely protected warrior, even when reality suggested a far more precarious outcome. The Hittite records, quieter and less monumental, emphasized strategic success rather than personal heroism, reflecting a different cultural approach to authority and legitimacy. Over time, the treaty itself became more significant than the battle. It represented a recognition that power had limits, even for the greatest empires of the age. It acknowledged that survival sometimes required compromise, and that stability could be more valuable than conquest. This shift did not end warfare in the ancient world, but it introduced a framework for managing rivalry without constant bloodshed. The story of Kadesh, then, is not just about chariots and kings. It is about how fear, ambition, and uncertainty shape decisions at the highest level. It shows how miscalculation can bring even the strongest ruler to the edge of disaster, and how restraint can emerge not from idealism, but from necessity. As Egypt and the Hittite Empire settled into their uneasy peace, they unknowingly set a precedent that would echo far beyond their own time, influencing how future civilizations understood war, diplomacy, and the fragile balance between them. Yet even this carefully constructed peace existed within a world that was changing faster than either empire could fully grasp, and the forces that would eventually sweep them away were already gathering strength beyond the borders they fought so hard to defend. The fragile balance created by the treaty did not mean that fear disappeared from the ancient world. It simply changed shape. Egypt and the Hittite Empire now watched each other not across a battlefield, but across a diplomatic line drawn by mutual caution. Both sides understood that breaking the agreement would not just restart war, but shatter credibility. In a system where divine witnesses were invoked, violating a treaty risked more than military retaliation. It threatened cosmic disorder, something neither society took lightly. Peace, in this sense, became another tool of power, one that required constant maintenance and careful performance. For Ramesses II, the years following Kadesh became a long exercise in managing perception. He doubled down on monument building, commissioning temples, statues, and inscriptions on a scale unseen before. These were not merely acts of vanity, they were political statements carved into stone, reminding Egypt and the wider world that the pharaoh remained strong, favored by the gods, and unchallenged within his realm. The story of Kadesh, as told by Ramesses, froze the battle at its most heroic moment, deliberately ignoring the panic, confusion, and near disaster that had preceded it. History, as far as Egypt was concerned, was not what happened, but what endured. The Hittites pursued strength in a different way. Their empire relied less on monumental self-praise and more on administrative control. Treaties multiplied, alliances were reinforced, and diplomatic correspondence flowed across borders. The peace with Egypt became part of a larger network of agreements designed to stabilize a volatile region. In this system, Kadesh was not celebrated as a triumph, but treated as proof that calculated restraint could preserve imperial interests more effectively than endless war. Yet, beneath this appearance of stability, the world of the late Bronze Age was becoming increasingly brittle. The great powers of the region were interconnected through trade routes that stretched from the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Tin for bronze, grain for cities, timber for ships, and luxury goods for elites all moved along fragile networks that depended on political stability. A disruption in one area could ripple outward, destabilizing regions far beyond its origin. While Egypt and the Hittites managed their rivalry, these networks were quietly under strain. Kadesh, in retrospect, can be seen as a moment when the limits of imperial expansion became clear. Both empires had reached a point where further growth risked collapse rather than glory. Armies were expensive, logistics were fragile, and loyalty could not be enforced indefinitely through fear alone. The treaty did not solve these structural problems, but it delayed their consequences. It bought time, allowing both powers to survive a little longer in a world that was becoming increasingly unpredictable. From a broader historical perspective, the Battle of Kadesh represents one of the earliest recorded moments where war and diplomacy became visibly intertwined. Warfare alone could no longer guarantee outcomes. Information, negotiation, and reputation mattered just as much as force. The deception used by the Hittites before the battle and the propaganda deployed by Ramesses afterward reveal how control of narrative was already a strategic weapon. Power was no longer confined to the battlefield, it extended into memory, belief, and record. The soldiers who fought at Kadesh experienced none of this abstraction. For them, the battle was immediate, violent, and terrifying. Chariot warfare was fast and unforgiving. A broken axle, a panicked horse, or a missed command could mean instant death. Infantrymen faced the chaos of trampling wheels and whirling weapons, often without clear orders or understanding of the larger plan. The grandeur of imperial ambition meant little amid the dust, noise, and confusion of combat. Their suffering, largely invisible in royal inscriptions, was the true cost behind every carved victory scene. This disconnect between lived experience and official memory is one of the most important lessons Kadesh offers. The battle shows how states transform chaos into coherence after the fact, shaping narratives that serve power rather than truth. Ramesses' inscriptions do not lie outright, they selectively remember. The Hittite records do the same in their own way, emphasizing strategic outcomes while downplaying missed opportunities. Between these accounts lies a reality that can only be reconstructed through careful comparison and interpretation. The treaty that followed did something equally important. It acknowledged equality between rival powers in a world where dominance was often assumed to be absolute. By recognizing each other as legitimate rulers with defined borders and obligations, the Egypt and the Hittites took a step toward a more regulated international order. This did not eliminate violence, but it created rules that made restraint possible. In many ways, this was the beginning of diplomacy as a survival strategy rather than a temporary pause between wars. Over time, the memory of Kadesh influenced how later civilizations thought about conflict and peace. The idea that war could end not with total victory, but with mutual agreement, slowly took root. Treaties became tools not just for ending wars, but for preventing them. The recognition that even powerful states had limits became an unspoken lesson passed down through centuries of political thought. Still, the peace forged after Kadesh could not stop the tides of history. Within a century, the eastern Mediterranean world would be shaken by widespread collapse. Cities burned, trade routes vanished, and empires fell. The Hittite Empire would disappear entirely, leaving behind ruins and records buried beneath the earth. Egypt would survive, but diminished, its era of imperial dominance fading into memory. In this larger collapse, Kadesh stands out as both a warning and a high point, a moment when human societies came closest to managing their own ambitions before being overwhelmed by forces they could not control. The clash between Egypt and the Hittites was never just about one city or one battle. It was about how power was exercised, justified, and restrained in a complex world. Kadesh revealed the danger of arrogance, the effectiveness of deception, and the necessity of compromise. It showed that fear could drive men to fight, but also to negotiate. And it left behind a record not just of war, but of an idea that would shape human history long after chariots fell silent on the plains of Syria. The consequences of Kadesh extended far beyond the battlefield, influencing not just the immediate empires, but the entire framework of interstate relations in the Late Bronze Age. For Ramesses II, the aftermath of the battle was a lesson in the limits of brute force. Despite his elaborate monuments depicting him as the divine victor, he recognized that military conquest alone could not secure the northern frontier indefinitely. Egypt's northern provinces remained vulnerable, and every campaign required immense logistical planning, supplies, and manpower that strained both the treasury and the population. The pharaoh learned that sustaining an empire demanded not just conquest, but diplomacy, fortifications, and alliances, a lesson he incorporated into his decades-long reign. For the Hittites, Kadesh highlighted the duality of victory and restraint. Muwatalli II's ambush had nearly annihilated the Egyptian divisions, yet his decision not to fully commit allowed Egypt to recover. This cautious approach ensured the survival of his own forces and preserved the Hittite Empire's long-term strategic position. It revealed that in ancient warfare, overreaching at the wrong moment could undo a campaign's successes. For subsequent Hittite kings, the memory of Kadesh reinforced the importance of calculated diplomacy alongside military prowess. The empire would continue to consolidate control over Anatolia and northern Syria, but always mindful of the unpredictable capabilities of its southern neighbor. Kadesh also marked a turning point in how treaties and international agreements were conceived. The formal peace treaty signed years later was not a concession, it was a pragmatic recognition of reality. The agreement included clauses for non-aggression, mutual defense, and extradition, effectively creating one of the earliest recorded examples of international law. Both empires recognized that the cost of another direct confrontation could outweigh the benefits, and that long-term stability required acknowledgement of each other's legitimacy. This development reshaped the understanding of power. Supremacy was no longer defined solely by battlefield success, but also by the ability to negotiate, enforce, and maintain agreements that prevented mutually destructive conflicts. The impact of Kadesh on military tactics cannot be overstated. The battle demonstrated the limitations of chariot warfare, the central component of elite combat in both Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Egyptian chariots were fast and agile, optimized for flanking maneuvers, while Hittite chariots were heavier, designed for shock and psychological intimidation. The chaos of the battlefield, however, showed that neither design guaranteed victory. Terrain, surprise, coordination, and timing were equally decisive. Future military strategists, both in the ancient Near East and beyond, would study Kadesh as an example of how technology, while important, could be neutralized by tactical misjudgment and the fog of war. Moreover, Kadesh underscored the critical role of intelligence and misinformation. The Hittites' use of false deserters to manipulate Egyptian expectations highlights a sophisticated understanding of psychological operations centuries before such strategies became formalized. Conversely, Ramesses' over-reliance on incomplete intelligence shows the dangers of confirmation bias in decision-making. He heard only what he wanted to hear, and it almost led to disaster. This interplay between perception and reality, between what commanders believe and what actually exists on the ground, became a central theme in military thought, illustrating that knowledge and deception could be as powerful as steel. Culturally, Kadesh reinforced the intertwining of war, religion, and politics. Egyptian inscriptions presented the pharaoh as divinely guided, a solitary hero whose courage turned the tide of battle. This narrative was carefully constructed to maintain authority at home and project dominance abroad, even when reality was less favorable. The Hittites, though less monumental in their record-keeping, also framed the battle in terms of divine favor and legitimacy. Both societies recognized that legitimacy was as much a matter of perception and ritual as it was of military success. The battle, therefore, was not merely physical, it was a contest over narrative, reputation, and the sacred authority of kingship. In practical terms, the treaty that emerged set a precedent for diplomacy in the ancient world. It was more than a cessation of hostilities, it codified respect for borders, agreements for mutual protection, and mechanisms for resolving disputes without immediate recourse to war. This framework influenced not only the immediate successors of Egypt and the Hittites, but also later civilizations, including Assyria, Babylonia, and even classical empires such as Rome, which recognized the value of treaties and diplomatic negotiations as tools for preserving long-term power. Economically, the stabilization of the region following Kadesh allowed trade routes to reopen, linking the Nile, Levant, and Anatolia in a network of commerce that fueled urban centers and provided resources for both empires. Cities once caught between two powers regained relative autonomy under the supervision of their overlords, benefiting from the predictability created by diplomacy. This economic dimension of Kadesh illustrates how war, peace, and commerce were intertwined. The cessation of hostilities was as much about sustaining economies as it was about saving lives or preserving honor. The human cost of the battle, though minimized in official narratives, was immense. Thousands of soldiers and auxiliary troops died under terrifying conditions in the chariot charges and river crossings. The psychological toll extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers returned home with trauma, communities were disrupted by shifting alliances, and families mourned losses that would never be fully accounted for.
In this sense, Kadesh serves as a reminder that the grandeur of kings and the sophistication of treaties cannot erase the individual suffering that lies at the heart of war. Strategically, Kadesh also reshaped Egyptian and Hittite military doctrine. Egypt, traditionally reliant on chariot divisions as decisive forces, began to emphasize combined arms, fortifications, and intelligence more heavily in future campaigns. The Hittites, likewise, recognized the need for disciplined coordination and rapid communication to avoid ambushes or fragmented attacks. Both empires learned that victory required more than equipment and manpower. It required careful preparation, adaptation to terrain, and respect for the opponent's capabilities. The long-term historical significance of Kadesh is profound. It illustrates the interplay of ambition, intelligence, technology, and diplomacy in shaping world events. It shows that even in an age dominated by kings and armies, negotiation and compromise could emerge as instruments of survival. The battle and subsequent treaty influenced not only the immediate political landscape of the ancient Near East, but also the evolution of warfare, statecraft, and international relations for centuries. In many ways, Kadesh was a turning point, a moment when the ancient world began to recognize that the cost of war could exceed the benefit of conquest, and that survival often depended on ingenuity as much as courage.
As we reflect on the Battle of Kadesh today, its lessons resonate far beyond the ancient plains of Syria. It teaches that power is multifaceted, combining military might, psychological acumen, and strategic diplomacy. It demonstrates the dangers of overconfidence and the value of intelligence. It reminds us that even the most celebrated victories may conceal fragility, and that treaties, though imperfect, can stabilize what force alone cannot. The legacy of Kadesh endures not just in stone carvings and historical texts, but in the very principles of leadership, conflict resolution, and international diplomacy that continue to shape our world. Do you think the Battle of Kadesh was an inevitable confrontation between two rising powers, or could history have taken a different path if diplomacy had preceded war rather than followed it?